everyone. I'm Shreya Singh, an undergraduate student of Lady Shriram College for Women. Welcome to the session on Important Question, History Class 8, Chapter 6. The chapter's name is Weavers, Iron Smelters and Factory Owners. I will be discussing some important questions of this chapter. Coming to the first important question, how do the names of different textiles tell us about their history? Now we know that there was a great variety of cotton and silk textile, which were known by different names in England and in India as well. Now, when we look closely at the names of this textile, what do we notice is that they tell us about their history of trade, and the way of using them. We can understand this in a better way by taking some examples. So the first example is muslin. Muslin has been derived from the word Mosul, which is a place in present-day Iraq. It has been named after Mosul because it was the place where Europeans for the first time encountered Indian fine cotton cloth while it was being carried by the Arab merchants. From this time, muslin word became very popular and it was used worldwide. Coming to the second example, calico. Calico was derived from the word Calicut. Calicut is a place on the Kerala coast. It has been named so because when the Portuguese for the first time came in India, they landed in Calicut. They came in search of spices, but while they were returning back, they also took along with these spices some cotton textile. They referred this cotton textile as calico, which was named after Calicut. Subsequently, calico became the general name for all the cotton textile. The third example is bandhana. Now, it is so familiar to us because it has been derived from the Hindi word bandhana, which means time. And bandhana textile refers to any brightly colored and printed scarf for the neck or used for the head. The fourth example is chintz. Now, chintz has also been derived from the Hindi word chint and it refers to a cloth with small and colorful flowery design. Now, apart from these examples, we also have some clothes which were known by their place of origin. For example, Kasim Bazar, Patna, Calcutta, Odisha, and Jaipur. Coming to the second important question, why did the wool and silk producers in England protest against the import of Indian textile in the early 18th century? So for this, we need to know the background. In the 18th century, the Indian textile were very famous and popular due to their relative cheapness, because of their fine texture and exquisite craftsmanship. While the situation in England was such that the wool and silk producers they had just begun to develop. So they were very worried about the popularity of the Indian textile. So they know that they were unable to compete with the Indian textile. Therefore, they wanted a secure market for themselves where there was no entry of the Indian textile. They wanted a market without the interference of Indian textile. Coming to the third important question, how did the development of cotton industries in Britain affect textile producers in India? So for this also we need to understand that textile producers in India were very famous. They were exporting their textile in many countries. But when there was the beginning of the cotton industries in Britain, it had a huge impact on the Indian textile industry. First, Indian textile had to compete with British textile in the American and European markets. Why was this happening? Because the British textile, it was expanding, it was increasing its production, and it was maintaining its and doing its hold over markets. Because of this, Indian textile find it very hard to compete. Second, exporting textile to England became increasingly difficult because very high duties were imposed on Indian textile imported from Britain. Now, Indian weavers could not afford these very high duties, so it almost became impossible for them to export this Indian textile to different countries like Britain and other countries. Third, now in such a situation, when the colonial government was supporting industrialization, the English and the European companies they stopped buying goods from the Indian producers. Now, when they stopped buying goods, what happened that no advances were received by the Indian weavers. As there were no advances, they had no money for the production. So this worsened the situation. And as a result, what happened? Many weavers became unemployed. Some of them changed their professions, they reverted to some other, but some of them remained unemployed. The other important question, why did the Indian iron smelting industry decline in the 19th century? So we know that the Indian iron smelting industry was very popular, not only in India but throughout the Europe. It fascinated the European scientists. What were the reasons then? Why did it decline? So the very first reason were the new forest laws. Now these were the laws which prohibited the local people from entering the reserved forests. Now, how did it impacted the Indian iron smelting industry? So what happened that now after these laws, Indian smelters could not enter the reserved forest. So they could not have access to the wood and to the iron ore. Now why wood was so essential? So wood was very essential in the process of smelting because it was required for the burning of charcoal. But as they did not have access, it became difficult for them to maintain the smelting industry. Now we do have some examples where government did grant access to the people that they could enter the forest and they could take the produce. But in such places as well, iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they use. Now, iron smelters, it was very hard for them to pay high taxes. So, obviously, there would be a decline in their income. So, this is what happened. The second important reason was that in the 19th century, there was import of iron and steel from Britain. It started. And because of this, what happened? That the ironsmiths in India, they started using this imported iron, either of using the local iron ore, which was made by the Indian smelters, they started using this imported iron. Now, because of this, the demand of the iron produced by the Indian smelters declined. Now, other reason was that during this period of 19th century, there were many famines which destroyed the dry tracts for iron smelters. This worsened the situation. The livelihood became impossible. Now later, they also faced problem with the coming up of iron and steel factories in India itself. Now as they used to, it was manual labor, they could not compete with the factories. Now this worsened the situation much more. Other important question, what problems did the Indian textile industry face in the early years of its development? Now, it is obvious that when the Indian textile industry started, it was not easy to become famous in a go. So, there were some problems faced. First, it found it difficult to compete with the cheap textile imported from Britain. Now, the textile which were imported from Britain, they were cheap because they were produced by the machines. Manual labor was not a big factor there, but in India, it was. So, it was very difficult to compete with them. Second, government supported industrialization by imposing heavy duties on imports. Now, the Indian textile industry, if they had to do the export, they had to pay a very high duty. Also, the industries in other countries, they were provided protection by the government of that country. So, the Indian textile industry could not compete with the other industry. So, what we see that the Indian textile industry could not export because of these high duties which were imposed on it. This eliminated competition. Third, colonial government refused such protection to local industries. So colonial government, the British government, was not giving such protection to the Indian textile industry as it was being given in other countries. So the situation became very difficult for the Indian textile industry. The other question, What helped TISCO expand steel production during the First World War? Now, during the First World War, the situation was changing and it was changing in favor of TISCO. The First World War started in 1914 and it ended in 1918. We know that before the war, the iron was being imported from England till now, okay? But what happened during the war, England, whatever the steel which was produced in England, it was used for the demands of war in Europe. And as the import declined dramatically, the Indian Railways had to turn for TISCO because they didn't have any other option. So they had to turn to TISCO for the supply of rails. We know that the war it dragged for 4 years. Now TISCO it also got the opportunity to produce shells and carriage wheels for the war. So the colonial government it became increasingly dependent on TISCO company. If we look at the data, by 1919 the government was buying 90% of the steel which was manufactured by TISCO. And as a result, over time, TISCO became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. So this was all for today. Thank you for attending this session.